Sorry I can't be with you in person today. I'd just like to say a couple of words about my long, close, very valued association with Ed over 50 years, when we were very close friends in constant contact in a perhaps unusual way. We almost never met, maybe 2 or 3 times. If I hadn't seen pictures of him, I suspect that if I saw him on the street, I wouldn't recognize him. But we were working very closely together, discussing all sorts of things constantly, without a break for about 50 years. I first came into contact with Ed's work when I read his small book, Atrocities in Vietnam. Must have been the late 60s, and as typical of Ed's work, it was scrupulous, careful, and damning. We quickly got into contact. We began work on our first book, Counter-Revolutionary Violence. It was published a couple of years later. It was by a small but flourishing new press that was preparing materials for universities. They published, I think, 20,000 copies. Some advertising went out. And then interesting development took place, which some of you know about. An executive of the conglomerate that owned the publisher saw the advertising, didn't like it, asked to see the book, was outraged, demanded that the publisher withdraw the book. They refused. They made various suggestions. Finally, he just decided to put the publisher out of business, destroying our book, of course, but destroying all of its stock. We brought the matter to the attention of some noted civil libertarians who saw no problem. It was not state censorship, and if a private corporation, a major conglomerate, decides to destroy all the books of a small publishing house, how could that be an infringement on freedom of speech, given our principles and doctrines, which has a certain validity and tells us something about the society in which we live and its principles. We went to work on other things. We also decided to expand this small book into a much larger one, worked on it for a couple of years, among other things, and finally came out with 2 volumes of Political Economy of Human Rights, which covered a wide range of topics. Ed introduced his typical sardonic, pointed locutions, which we used as a framework: worthy, unworthy victims, constructive, benign, and nefarious bloodbaths, a couple of others. Of the bloodbaths, an example of a constructive bloodbath which we discussed was the huge massacre that took place in Indonesia in 1965, killing hundreds, thousands of people, destroying the political system, opening the country to Western, mainly U.S. investors that had rich resources. The bloodbath was pretty accurately described. Time magazine spent most of an issue devoted to what they called a boiling bloodbath. The New York Times editorialized about the staggering mass murder, which was a gleam of light in Asia, and they praised the American government for keeping its own direct involvement more or less secret, so as to allow all the credit to be given to what they called the moderate Indonesian generals who were now in charge. That was a constructive bloodbath. There was also a nefarious bloodbath. We devoted a long chapter to the atrocities underway in the late 70s in Cambodia. that was nefarious because it could be attributed to someone else, at least if we overlooked the massive bombing, U.S. bombing of the rural countryside in the preceding years, which laid the basis for the atrocities that took place. But if we omit that minor point, it was a nefarious bloodbath blamed on others. We compared that in detail to another bloodbath, a benign one that really didn't matter, namely the one in East Timor. It's a very natural comparison. That was this comparison was the centerpiece of the two volumes. There were many other topics, but these two were compared. East Timor and Cambodia are very natural comparisons. Huge atrocities, same region of the world, same years. East Timor went on for many years afterwards. Roughly comparable in scale. In East Timor, actually probably greater relative to the population and, of course, in the course of aggression, which makes it worse. But a natural comparison. And we went through the two of them in great detail, and what we found was, not surprising to us, that in both cases there were massive lies of an order that would have impressed Stalin, but in opposite directions. In the case of Cambodia, fabrications, vast fabrications, repeated after they were shown to be fabrications, that try to exaggerate as much as possible the scale of the nefarious bloodbath. In the case of East Timor, denial, rejection of the facts, dismissal, and very little comment. And there were two crucial differences between the two bloodbaths. In the case of Cambodia, nobody had any suggestion about anything to do about it. It was somebody else's crime. We couldn't do anything about it. In the case of East Timor, we could do everything about it. It was a U.S. crime. The U.S. Supported it all the way, gave the crucial military diplomatic support, blocked any action at the United Nations, so on. And we could have stopped it instantly. Now, that was obvious all along, and in fact it was demonstrated years later. Then comes the reaction. On the case of East Timor, which is of course the far more important one, no comment, silence. On the case of Cambodia, huge outrage, more lies, more condemnations. We finally decided, the two of us, this must have been the best article we ever wrote, because with all of the massive efforts to show that somehow we were apologizing for communist atrocities, nobody could even find a misplaced comma. And when the book was reprinted years later, we didn't change a word. So that was Political Economy of Human Rights. We then went on to other things. We turned soon to the book that came out called Manufacturing Consent. In this case, it was mostly Ed's work. So I insisted, he objected, but I insisted that contrary to our usual practice of alphabetic listing as authors, his name had to come first. So it's Herman and Chomsky. He constructed the basic outline, the analysis, the institutional analysis, which of course drew from his very significant work on corporate power and corporate control, a major study in the field. That was his work. The careful statistical analyses that compared, for example, the reaction to the murder of one Polish priest in communist Poland. The murderers quickly found, tried, prison. Comparison of that to over 100 religious martyrs in El Salvador, for which we were responsible. Silence, dismissal, no prosecution, and just barely beginning today, years later, to have prosecutions. It was very striking, and several other cases. Well, we also discussed there the way in which the media function serve what Ed proposed we call, and I agreed, a kind of propaganda function. It's nothing like the nonsense today about fake news. they do their work professionally, seriously. In fact, about a third of the book was defense of the media for their professionalism, a defense against severe and disgraceful and deeply, highly distorted attacks, as we showed from Freedom House, a liberal human rights group, which was attacking the media for, they claimed, losing the war in Vietnam, which was, of course, nonsense. But the media do their job seriously, but within a framework of choices and shaping that reflects institutional power. That's the basic thing we tried to demonstrate. That doesn't mean the media are not reliable. It means you can learn a lot from them, as we do. Nothing like what's going on today. Now, that was the major thrust of this book in some detail, and as I say, mainly Ed's work. We published a second edition about 15 years later, about early 2000s. We made a few changes, not much. If we were to redo it today, I think I can speak for Ed in this case. We again wouldn't change very much. I think its main story is pretty much the same. We then went on with further work, some jointly, some separately, again keeping in close contact. Ed's legacy is one of enormous significance. He did his work with immense integrity, care, scrupulousness, and complete lack of concern for what anyone would think about it. We understood very well that if you give a deep, not only scathing, but accurate institutional critique of the structure of power, not just putting things aside as mistakes or carelessness, it's not going to be beloved. And but that to him was of no significance, didn't seem to matter in the least, just went ahead with his work, left a legacy of integrity, care, honesty, that is a model for those who want to analyze and understand and proceed to change the world.